Hi, I'm going to be talking about questions to do with disagreement, ideology, and testimony. I want to start by considering the following case, which I'm calling Sexist Taxi Driver. Layla, a young woman, and her friend Joseph, a young man, get into a taxi together. During the ride, the taxi driver asks Layla if Joseph is her boyfriend and inquires as to her place of work and home address. Afterwards, Layla remarks that the taxi driver was exhibiting inappropriate and sexist behavior. Joseph disagrees. He suggests to Layla that the driver was only being friendly and that Layla is wrong in believing this incident is sexist. Here, I think that many would take it to be intuitive that Layla is epistemically justified in her belief and Joseph is not. We can understand this through reference to differences in epistemic position, so that Layla and Joseph are not epistemic peers. In this case, Layla and Joseph appear to differ in terms of relevant background knowledge and perhaps relevant biases. So we might think that Layla is more likely to have an insight into patterns of sexual harassment that systematically disadvantage women. Perhaps this knowledge arises in part through her own past experiences. And we could bring in resources from feminist social epistemology to further explain how this difference in epistemic position is generated. So, for example, turning to Lorraine Code's concept of situated knowers, where the social location of a knower shapes their access to knowledge. And in this case, we could reasonably believe that Layla's social location, i.e. her gender, affords her an epistemic advantage in terms of identifying instances of sexual harassment or sexism. So it would be straightforward in this case to judge that Layla is justified in her belief and Joseph is not, and then an outside observer should believe Layla's interpretation over Joseph's. Now let's consider a slightly different case, gender essentialist lecturer. Two women, Ash and Shruti, are taking the same course at college together. They attend a class where the lecturer discusses neuroscience studies that purport to show biological differences in cognition between men and women. The lecturer claims that these studies show that men are more innately suited to scientific reasoning and women are more innately suited to caregiving. After class, Ash states that the lecturer's use of evidence and interpretation of that evidence was sexist. Shruti disagrees, arguing that although she shares Ash's political commitment to gender equality, the lecturer's use and interpretation of the evidence was not sexist. So this case differs from the previous one in that we can't readily understand this disagreement in terms of a difference of epistemic position or standpoint. In this case, it's explicitly stated that both actors are women. I think we can also stipulate that they are also similarly socially located in all relevant aspects, race, class, etc. We can also assume competence, so assume that both of them are sufficiently informed with respect to the relevant evidence. So, how should we understand these cases? One way would be to argue that some beliefs are produced through an ideologically distorted mechanism. This is what Amya Srinivasan outlines in her defense of externalism for epistemic justification. She considers a set of what she terms bad ideology cases, where what matters is how an agent's beliefs relate to systems of social oppression. And under this view, the difference between Ash and Shruti, in the case that I've just outlined, might lie in their ability to pierce through ideological distortion versus having their truth tracking capacities distorted. I'm terming this interpretation material harms because somebody is justified because of the relation between their beliefs and the structures of the world that bring about systematic material harms. And conversely, somebody is not justified because those structures have acted to distort their belief. So to bring out this ideological distortion point a bit more clearly, here's an example from the Srinivasan paper of this woman who is regularly beaten by her husband, and after reflection and consultation, she concludes that women deserve to be beaten by their husbands when they misbehave. And here I also have the reply by Srinivasan that this woman's belief that she deserves to be beaten is not justified, it's not merely false, but moreover the product of a convincing and systematic patriarchal illusion. And this is also interpretation that we find in standpoint theory. So standpoint theory is usually described in terms of three theses. The situated knowledge thesis, that is that there's no view from nowhere and all epistemic agents are socially located. The epistemic advantage thesis, where those in marginalized social locations may have privileged epistemic access, and the achievement thesis, illustrated by this quote from Harding: achieving a standpoint requires scientific work in order to see beneath the ideological surface of social relations that we all come to accept as natural. So this means that some individuals will have a kind of false consciousness where they've internalized these dominant ideologies of patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. Earlier formulations of standpoint theory were criticized for implying that epistemic privilege is automatically afforded to marginalized individuals and for those apparently essentializing tendencies. And so later formulations have therefore emphasized that standpoints are achieved through critical reflection and not automatically given. And commonly, this is interpreted as a claim that anyone in principle can achieve a given standpoint, but individuals in particular social locations are just more likely to achieve it. So again, when we're thinking about the previous two cases, under this interpretation, we could see Layla in the sexist taxi driver case and Ash in the gender essentialist lecturer case. We could see them as having achieved the relevant standpoint and the other agents have not. However, I'm going to introduce a case that might problematize what I'm calling the material harms approach. This case is called White Savior. Martha, a British woman of white European descent, has learned of research into the differences between IQ across different racial groups and complains to her partner Janelle, a Black British woman, that this research is racist. Janelle, having read the same information as Martha has on this research, argues that she does not think it's racist. And although similar research has been weaponized in the past, current studies represent legitimate scientific inquiry. In response, Martha suggests she is suffering from internalized racism that's distorting her ability to get to the truth. So in this case, we have a disagreement between someone who at first we might take to be in an epistemically advantaged position, so a Black person discussing race, and someone in what we might think at first to be an epistemically disadvantaged position. In this case, we think the person more likely to be epistemically disadvantaged is in fact justified. So if we are sympathetic to the assessment that certain research into race and IQ propagates white supremacy, and if we understand this disagreement in terms of the material harms approach, then Martha is justified and Janelle is not. Furthermore, Martha is correct in her claim that Janelle's belief is affected by internalized racism. However, I think that this illustrates a problem with the material harms interpretation. I think it's plausible that we're going to have some intuitive discomfort here with Martha's dismissal of Janelle's position. And there's something about that testimony coming from an individual in her social position that's not being captured here. An important question at this point is whether there's really an epistemic dimension to this or whether it's purely moral or political. Clearly, there is something moral or political going on here. There's a history and an ongoing context where white voices are privileged over Black voices, regardless of what's being said. However, I think there's also an epistemic dimension. In the achievement thesis, as usually construed, a particular standpoint can be achieved in principle by anyone, regardless of social location, although some will be more likely to achieve it than others. However, I think that more nuance is needed in how we think about the role of social location or lived experience in the generation of beliefs. So here I'm going to provide a rough sketch of what this nuance might look like. This is still a work in progress, so I'm not going to produce a fleshed out account here, but I suggest that the achievement thesis has some perhaps problematic implications. So importantly, once we have stipulated someone's set of beliefs or judgments, we no longer need to be sensitive to differences in social location. And this is because in order to meaningfully dodge charges of essentialism or automatic privilege, we need to be able to say what it means to have achieved a particular standpoint. However, under that framework, I think we face problems in explaining the kinds of cases like the white savior case, and I think we need to allow for a more nuanced role for social location. And this role might pull us in the opposite direction in certain cases, although maybe our overall judgment in a lot of these cases will remain the same. I think there are at least two ways in which we could cash this out. Firstly, either in terms of a competing value, which has an epistemic dimension, such as authenticity, or by broadening what we mean by competence of epistemic agents. So, for example, social location and lived experience might offer kinds of competencies that cannot be acquired in other ways. And this renewed emphasis on social location has the implication that it allows us to attend to the ways in which lived experience can surprise. So what I mean by that is that there will be cases of disagreements where we think we know what it means to adopt a marginalized standpoint, but insights generated by lived experience can disrupt these. So the upshots of this are, firstly, that it's not necessarily a return to automatic epistemic privilege, and it doesn't necessarily mean an inversion of judgments in large sets of cases. However, we might be able to provide better explanations of the complexity of our judgments in particular cases. In particular, attend to disagreements between similarly socially positioned actors in a different way than disagreements between individuals from dominant and marginalized groups. So, for example, this would allow us to distinguish the gender essentialist lecturer case from an identical case between an individual from a dominant and a marginalized group, where they're saying exactly the same things that they were saying in the gender essentialist lecturer case. And also cases where individuals from dominant marginalized groups agree. So even if the beliefs, the statements are the same, we might want to say that we have more confidence in something coming from somebody with lived experience than somebody that hasn't, and thinking more carefully about this role of social location can allow us to understand that judgment. And I'm just going to conclude by briefly suggesting the kinds of real examples of real world cases that this approach could better explain. So firstly, the phenomenon of white allyship, or the ways in which white allies in conversations about race can have quote unquote correct beliefs and yet don't seem to be fully competent. Secondly, the debate about caregiving versus wage labor in feminist thought. So, and this ties back to the capacity for lived experience to surprise. So, a dominant theme, I think, in feminist thought in the past and even now is that women in the workforce is necessarily empowering, that wage labor is necessarily empowering, and caregiving is necessarily demeaning. And then within activist communities, there's been a discourse about how for certain women, caregiving can be nourishing, can be empowering, and wage labor can have the opposite effect. And I think this is a lesson in how, if we go in with ideas of what it means to be ideologically distorted, or what it means to adopt a particular standpoint, then that might lead us astray, and that might lead us to misunderstand or mischaracterize disagreements within communities. And then the final suggestion is somewhat controversial, of debates about female genital cutting, both within and without these communities, and the extent to which the practice of female genital cutting is or is not misogynistic, patriarchal, or even harmful. And I think that attending to this, this role of social location in generating beliefs can allow us to have a fuller, richer account of judgments in these kinds of cases. Thank you.